Good afternoon. I guess there's one person left, huh? Good afternoon. Thank you, thank you. So I know it's late, and you're probably tired. And I want to say it's later than you think. So it's a delight to be here. I really enjoy working with SEIU, and particularly Jerry. And I think, and I've said to SEIU many times to them, and I'll say it to you, I know some of you are with other unions, and I think this may be as true with you, but I have worked probably most closely with SEIU. We are in trouble, and while it's not clear it's going to work out, if it does work out, SEIU is going to be a central player in that fight. So what is the fight? I want to build off of some things that Mary Wright Edelman and Doug shared with us. And it's actually pretty simple. First of all, just a footnote to some of the things that Doug said. In some ways, this is a complicated history, and I would recommend 3 books to help unravel this history. Doug's book, which I have on my Kindle, my book, Racing to Justice, and Ian Haney-Lopez's book, Dog Whistle Politics. The others I could recommend, like Fighting Poverty in the United States and Europe by Alessina, A World of Difference. We looks at social welfare programs in the United States and Europe and tries to understand what's the difference. And there's a lot more. Katznelson, Fear Itself, a wonderful book. A little long, 700 pages, but worth the read. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to give you some highlights to sort of capture what some of these books are saying. Try to do it in a very shorthanded way. So the addition I would make to Doug's wonderful book is that since the Civil War, there's actually been 3 parties in the country, not 2. So when you see the big swing between the Democrats and Republicans, really what you're seeing is the party, the South, which is a separate party, moving from one column to the other. And with it, they move the party they join. And the party they join, it's like we have a parliamentary system like Europe. So, you know, in Europe, one party wins, maybe they don't have enough seats, and they have to go looking to the minority party to join to make a government. In a sense, that's what we have. The South is that minority party, and their cost of joining is always racialized. So when you have the Democratic Party that Doug described as being schizophrenic, it's not quite as schizophrenic as it seems. It's the Democratic Party and it's the South. We call them Dixiecrats. That wasn't limited to the South, but it was largely the South. And then we had the Republican Party and the South. Now what's interesting in a way, and what's happening now, is a new expression of that, because it used to be that the South was, in a sense, powerful, but they had their own caucus. What's happening now is the South is actually transforming the entire Republican Party. And so when you look at all the right-to-work states, they're not concentrated in the South anymore. They're actually moving across the entire country. So that's one thing. So this is actually new. The minority party is literally becoming a majority party, and to some very pernicious ends. And the thing that's animating that, and it's always been animating that much of America doesn't get, and I would say much of the progressive movement doesn't get, and I would say much of the labor movement doesn't get, is that the South is obsessed with race. Obsessed with race. You think it's black people that's obsessed with race. No, it's the South. I mean, deeply obsessed with race, and they're driving national politics. And those national politics has terrible implications for our democracy, terrible implications for the labor movement, terrible implications for the economy. And so I would say unless we join that struggle, we lose on every one of those axes. So another way of saying this, and I say this, look at this slide here, we organize ourselves along many axes, but there are 3 that I want to draw your attention to now. One is economic, and that's what most unions sort of organize around in terms of pay and sometimes working conditions, other benefits. The other one is political. That's what parties sort of organize around in terms of who controls, who makes the rules of the game. Obviously, these 2 things are very much related, because you make the rules of the game to actually control the economy. So those two things are not unrelated. But the third area is the area which we actually don't play in very much. And that is the area of who we are, how we define our collective being. So I teach at Berkeley, so we can't say that. We have to use bigger words like ontological. These are deeply ontological questions. And because they're ontological questions, who are we? Samuel Huntington, who teaches at Harvard, a right-wing conservative. Now, I've already given you a list of books to buy. I want to make sure you don't confuse the list and include Huntington's book on the list. So I'm not suggesting you buy the book. But I'm going to tell you what he says in the book. The book is titled, Who Are We? Not what do we have. Who are we? And he goes on in the book, he describes who we are. He says a couple of things. First of all, he says, the United States is not an immigrant country. It's a settler country. It was settled by two groups, and everyone else who comes is required to adhere to the norms and values of those groups. They're not allowed to come and start changing those norms and those values. So, okay, well, I don't know if I buy that, but go on, Sam. Who are these groups anyway? He says there are two groups. One's called Anglos, England, and the other's Saxons. Anglo-Saxons. These are the two groups, not German, not Italian, not French, Anglo-Saxons. Those are the two groups. Unless you're an Anglo-Saxon, you're a guest. And then he says, not just Christian, Protestant. Individualistic, hardworking. And he goes on. If he'd written this book in the 60s, he would have said white. He's describing the hardest core of conservative white Americans. He said, this is who America is. And we're losing that. And so when he looks at demographic changes, he's saying to these groups, you should be afraid, not simply because you're about to lose your job or your health care, but you're about to lose your collective identity. Where all these people are coming to America and they're not really Americans. They can't become really Americans. And you should be afraid. And if you look at stuff, surveys and stuff from the people who identify around the Tea Party, they literally are afraid. And they're not primarily afraid about jobs. Because if you think about when they voted, when Congress was voting to shut down the government and to renege paying the debt, virtually no economist was saying this is good economic policy. Everyone said this is going to cause the economy to actually plummet. You're going to be worse off economically. The response to the Tea Party was, we don't care. And in fact, the people who fought that battle in Congress, their coffers were filled afterwards because they're standing up for America being for Americans. Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, English-speaking, hardworking, white people. So that's the book Who We Are. Jeff Chan, not to be outdone by Samuel Huntington, wrote a different book. This one you can buy if you want. It's called Who We Be. He looks at the same data that Huntington is looking at and says, yes, the country's changing. Our collective identity is changing. There's a browning of America. And Samuel Huntington says, there's a browning of America. Jeff Chan says, there's a browning of America. That's pretty cool. There's a deep divide in America about the changes, about the demographic change. And what Ian has done in his book is to say, the Republicans have taken the Southern strategy and turned it into a national strategy to try to appeal and whip up anxiety in white Americans. And that policy, which we can trace back to the late 60s, early 70s, is what's driving national politics. That just came from a conference on inequality and closing the wealth gap. And the point I made there is there are two gaps. There are gaps between the elites and the rest of us, and there are gaps between whites and non-whites. And those two gaps are related, and both of them are driven by race, but in different ways. that the very nature of the restructuring of the economy or neoliberalism, of repurposing government away from people to the elites, is driven by the anxiety that Samuel Huntington is whipping up, the anxiety of the Tea Party. And so those of us who think, well, so this issue of race is not about a distribution of what blacks or Latinos or Native Americans or Asians get. It's about an anxiety about who we are that's used to repurpose government in favor of the elites. And that's what we're seeing right now in terms of the Republican Party. And we're seeing it not just in the United States, but really all over the world around, not necessarily race, but around othering. So we're watching stuff happen in Europe. In fact, we just had a conference, and we called it othering, because it's not just race, but it's creating anxiety about loss of self because of the other. And so in Europe, it takes the form of religion or Islam. In other places, it take other forms. But wherever you see this, there's an opportunity for a deep anxiety about who we are, not what we have. And most of us who are left of center, and most of us who call ourselves progressives or unions, only focus on those first two axes. In fact, someone wrote a book. They called it, What's Wrong with Kansas? What's the matter with Kansas? And as you may know, there's a newer book or paper out titled, What's the Matter with Kansas? And what's the matter with Kansas is that Tom Frank, he's confused. He's saying, why is white people voting against their interests? Have any of you ever heard that expression? Why are these, almost like these people, they're not very smart. They're voting against their interests. Don't they know if they vote for us, they'll get more money? They're not voting their economic interests. They're voting their ontological interests. And actually, that's much deeper for all of us. Who we are matters more to us than what we have. Now, again, all those things are related. And when I talk about this some, I also talk about the mind and the unconscious, and we know how the unconscious works. When we try to figure out what people really experience or feels, we don't ask them. We measure it, and we measure the unconscious. And what we see is that America is becoming deeply, deeply anxious as we become more diverse. This is a poll, a study done, and you probably can't read it, but the top bar is asking Americans how do they feel about growing racial and ethnic diversity. And most Americans say, are you worried about it? And they'll say, no, I'm not worried about it, 13%. And then when we measure at an unconscious level, the unconscious will say, we're actually quite worried. The conscious might not be worried about it, but the unconscious, we're very worried about it. And this is true among Democrats, Republicans, old people, young people. And again, so the elites have learned to actually play through this through dog whistle, through send messages. You should be afraid of what's happening. And we know, as good post-civil rights citizens of this country, we're not supposed to have racial anxiety. So we don't express it and we don't acknowledge it at the conscious level, but it's still happening at the unconscious level. Now, this conference is about what's happening in terms of the public space. A couple of things. First of all, we talk about public versus private. I want to suggest to you that that's a misnomer, that that's not a very useful way of talking about what's happening in our country. In part because they're not two spaces, public versus private, they're four. Public, which is collective action, government, and physical space where the public is invited. Private, now if you go back to private as understood by the people who started this country, some of y'all fathers, they understood private as small individuals, small artisans, and a space where you could actually go and be free from the control of government. Now, when they said that, they were trying to create a space that people were relatively safe from concentrated power. When they talked about being free from concentrated power in government, they were actually talking about corporations and government, because at the time, corporations was part of government. So they very much understood that for people to really be free, they had to be free, have a zone of protection, not just from government, but also from corporation. About 50 years later, corporations start pulling itself away from government. and creating something different. And it wasn't private, and it wasn't quite public, it was corporate. So corporation is a third sphere that's neither public nor private. That's important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The fourth sphere is non-public, non-private. And that has historically and continues to be the population that is most vulnerable, that don't have an effective public voice, and don't have a private place to retreat to. And it's not a small group. So at the founding of the country, that included slaves, no public voice, no private place to retreat to. It included women. Women didn't have a public voice, and I often say, yes, the home was the man's castle, but it was the woman's dungeon. There's a wonderful little quip between Scalia and Ginsburg about marriage in the cases now before the Supreme Court. And Scalia makes the observation that certainly a man and a man can't get married, a woman and a woman can't get married. I don't know how you think about this, but it's an interesting fight between Ginsburg and Scalia. And Scalia goes on and says, the institution of marriage has been around for thousands of years, and it's always been between a man and a man and a woman. And so certainly it could not have been historically, in terms of precedent, anything else. Ginsburg's response is, the institution of marriage that exists today is new. The institution of marriage that existed 100 years ago was where a man had the complete right to dominate a woman. It was an institution of subordination of a woman and not an institution of love. The institution that's organized around love today is new. And in that institution, there's no reason it should just be between a man and a woman. The point I'm making is that the home during that old institution was not the woman's castle, it was the man's castle. And the woman was under complete subjugation of the man. So let's come up to today. The reason this is important is that we have a special relationship to privacy. And so we think private is good. And so when we talk about private, it's like, yes, private is good. And we also have a special complication with public. And the complication is this. America used to like public. We like public housing, we like public schools, we like public hospital, as long as the public was all white. We liked the public as long as the public only reflected white people. And when the public became more diverse, including some of those people who had been in the non-public space, we actually didn't like the public so much. In fact, we had words for it. In terms of cities, we called it white flight. People are coming in that don't look like white people. Can we go someplace else? And the federal government's facilitated that. So the point is that, and this is one thing I would say, we've never had a democracy that was inclusive. So whether we talk about beginning of democracy, whether we talk about the New Deal, it was always predicated on, it's largely for a certain group of people. And that the effort to bring in other people, largely the civil rights, King and Johnson, we had this immediate white anxiety. And that's the political space we're dealing with today. And so I would say, I agree that we can have policies to change that, whether it's for kids or whether it's for unions, but not until we deal with this ontological problem. That's the problem that we're tripping over. We're not failing because of lack of policy, but because the anxiety, the profound anxiety that drives this country is actually is disuniting this country and threatening our democracy. So I'll end by just saying this. I talk about this in my book, and Doug talks about it. I think the lesson on the left that you don't talk about race because it's divisive is exactly wrong. Because we're constantly talking about race through dog whistle. But we think of talking about race as talking about what blacks get, what Latinos get, and we think about it divisive because we're taking from whites and given to people of color. What I'm talking about is the structuring of our politics, the structuring of our economy that, yes, is taken from blacks, taken from whites, and taken from Latinos, and taken from whites. It's taking from everyone and redistributing both economic power, but also political power to the elites that threatens our very democracy. And people are so, meaning the Tea Party, is so obsessed with you're going to take and give it to those undeserving, they're willing to sacrifice some of their own economic well-being in order to punish the undeserving that Nixon and Reagan talked about when they ran for office. So remember Reagan, there are poor people and there's the undeserving poor. Remember Nixon, he said the New Deal was a good thing when it was helping people, most of us, but now we're taxing people to help the undeserving. And this is part of the swing of the South. And what have we done? We keep focusing just on the economic, thinking if we show people you're going to get more money, they'll be happy. We have to actually start to name this anxiety and offer people an alternative, and there's a way to do that. And if we do that, not only can we win in terms of unions, win in terms of labor, win in terms of our democracy, we also can get a public space that's inviting to everyone in our country. Thank you.